Hello everyone! Summer Games Fest just happened a few days before the making of this video, and the main highlight of the show was definitely the announcement trailer of Resident Evil Requiem. As a Resident Evil fan myself, I decided to look back on all the previous games of the series and examine how the series had evolved to ultimately culminate in Requiem. So get ready, because this is going to be a long journey. But before we start, I'd like to briefly talk about some things that I think are very important if we are trying to understand the Resident Evil series as a whole. First, we need to remember that those games are made by Japanese developers. But all of the games are either set in the United States or they have American protagonists. It's important to know that after World War II, Japan got occupied by American forces, and to this day we can see the influence of American culture on Japan. This implies that for Japanese people, Americans are the standard image that represents what a foreigner is. Taking all that into account, now we can see that the Resident Evil is a Japanese series in which the creators put themselves in the shoes of people outside of their society and culture, in other words, outside of their reality. So they're basically games about how the Japanese imagine foreign heroes dealing with problems from their foreign land. It's also worth mentioning that the protagonists of those games are always portrayed as heroes. They are always good and righteous people. So these games are not depictions of Americans as bad or anything like that. It also isn't an elevation of American culture by any stretch of the imagination, since the antagonists, like Umbrella, are also predominantly American. So the series recognizes that there are the good foreigners and the bad foreigners, which is actually the proper way to look at the outside of one's identity. Okay, now that I touched a little bit on the symbolism of the Resident Evil series, we can get more technical and move on to the games themselves. Oh, and there are basically going to be spoilers for all of the Resident Evil games in this video. Resident Evil was originally supposed to be the remake of a 1989 Famicom game called Sweet Home, which was a horror role-playing game based on a Japanese movie with the same name. This game was set in an abandoned mansion filled with monsters, and it had a big emphasis on puzzle solving and item management, characteristics that would later define the Resident Evil series. Production of the Sweet Home remake began in 1993. However, Capcom realized that they no longer held the rights that were tied to the movie, so they had no choice but to turn the project into an original IP, and that's how Resident Evil was born. So even the very first game in the series was created by building upon concepts left by a previous game. And as we're going to see, that's something that repeated itself many times throughout the Resident Evil series. Released in 1996, the plot of the original Resident Evil was set in 1998 in the Spencer Mansion, located at the Arklay Mountains on the outskirts of the American Midwestern town Raccoon City. A special force from the Raccoon City Police, called STARS, was dispatched to investigate a series of mysterious murders occurring in the mountains. Bravo Team, which was dispatched first, did not return nor send any message back to headquarters. So Alpha Team was dispatched to look for the missing members of Bravo Team and investigate what had happened. During their investigation, the Alpha Team members get attacked by monster-like dogs, which later are revealed to be bioorganic weapons, or BOWs for short, and they are forced to escape into the Spencer Mansion. The only problem is, the mansion was also infested with BOWs, most notably zombies, who are the victims of the T-virus. The protagonists are the members of Alpha Team, Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, and the Captain Albert Wesker, who likes to wear sunglasses indoors. Not suspicious at all. There is also Brad Vickers, the chopper pilot, but he doesn't participate because he got scared and left the others behind in the first scene. The protagonists eventually discover that there is a secret laboratory hidden under the mansion, and that the laboratory is run by the pharmaceutical company Umbrella, which is set as the main antagonist of the series, at least initially, and whose founder was Oswald Spencer, the owner of the mansion. Umbrella was secretly developing bioweapons, and after something went wrong in the lab, the employees got infected with the T-virus and the mansion got infested with monsters, some of which had also escaped to the surrounding forest. At the end of the game, it's revealed that Albert Wesker, the captain of Alpha Team, was actually a double agent working for Umbrella who had infiltrated the Raccoon police force. But he ends up dying.
Don't come this way! No!
Just like Wesker, Barry is also working for the bad guys, but in his case, it's because he was blackmailed as the bad guys threatened to hurt his wife and daughters, and depending on the route the player takes, Barry may regret his betrayal and come over to the side of the good guys. The remaining members of Alpha Team then manage to escape along with Rebecca Chambers, the only surviving member of Bravo Team, just before the Spencer mansion explodes. And that's the story of the original Resident Evil. It is a pretty solid story and it definitely could have ended there, but the game was a big sales success and since Capcom wasn't dumb, they had to produce a sequel. But the mansion had exploded in the first game, so they had to think of a new location for the sequel. Naturally, they moved the main location from the outskirts of Raccoon City to the actual Raccoon City. In other words, they decided to take one step further and go from a mansion infested with monsters to a city infested with monsters. But now I have to mention one fact that is very important in regards to the development of all the Resident Evil games, and thus impacts the identity of the series as a whole and also helps us understand the philosophy of Resident Evil from the developer's perspective. The original Resident Evil was directed by Shinji Mikami, but in the sequel, the role of directing was passed to Hideki Kamiya. From this point forward, every new iteration in the series was going to have a different director, with a few exceptions, but we'll get to that. By doing this, the newer developers at Capcom could all eventually assume the role of director, and infuse the new games with their own unique flavor and ideas, and this would also guarantee that the series wouldn't become stagnant. I'm not saying that this was the initial intention behind the change of directors. Actually, it was Shinji Mikami that was going to direct the sequel, but he withdrew from the director position after having disagreements with the supervisor Yoshiki Okamoto. But eventually this change of directors ended up becoming sort of a tradition for the series, with only a few exceptions. However, there must also have been something that those developers could use, like some kind of rule, so that the following games wouldn't become too deviant and unrecognizable from the rest of the series. I do not know if this was actually a spoken rule or if it just happened without the developers at Capcom noticing. But the only rule that binds the Resident Evil series together is that each game must build from what had been already established in the previous games, both in terms of gameplay and story. Because of this, there is a tendency in the Resident Evil games to leave loose ends in the story. Many of the fans usually interpret those loose ends as laziness on the part of the writers and complain that they are the reason why the Resident Evil lore ended up getting so convoluted. And while those complaints are valid to some extent, we should also understand that that's the method that the developers use to leave room for potential sequels. Initially, Resident Evil 1 and 2 didn't have too much of a connection, except that they were both zombie games with the same gameplay style, and there were a few recognizable names like Raccoon City and Umbrella. But the game's prototype, which fans would eventually call Resident Evil 1.5, didn't look too exciting, and wasn't holding up to the expectations set by the previous game. So Capcom invited a professional Japanese television screenwriter called Noboru Sugimura to write a new script for Resident Evil 2's plot. Sugimura was actually a fan of the first game's story, so he also implemented some more connections between the two games, like making one of the playable protagonists, Claire Redfield, the younger sister of Chris, one of the protagonists from the first game. The second game was then released in 1998. Set 2 months after the events of the first game, Resident Evil 2 follows the characters Leon Kennedy, a rookie police officer who just arrived at Raccoon City for his first day on the job, and Claire Redfield, who went to Raccoon City looking for her missing brother Chris. When they arrive at the city, they soon find out that it had become a zombie-infested town, and both of them have to work together to escape. The game introduces other new characters, like the fan favorite Ada Wong, who dies near the end of the game, But don't worry, still in the same game it's revealed that she actually survived. But how did she survive? Don't think too hard about it. And also Sherry Birkin, the daughter of the villain scientist couple of the game. It also introduces a new virus, called the G virus, which is even more dangerous than the T virus, due to the rapid mutations it provokes in its hosts. In fact, the G virus is so dangerous that it never got used again in the series, with a few exceptions, but we'll get to that. At the end of the game, they make some room for potential sequels by inserting this line.
Where?
Hey, it's up to us to take out Umbrella.
And the game also has a canonical extra mode called the Fourth Survivor, in which you play as Hunk, an Umbrella operative who retrieves a sample of the G virus. Resident Evil 2 is an overall improvement over the first game and is generally considered the better game between the two. The game was a big success, so obviously there would be more Resident Evil games coming. In fact, 2 Resident Evil games started being developed. The first was a spin-off set in Raccoon City at the same time as Resident Evil 2, but its events happened in parallel to the events of the second game in different parts of the city. This spin-off brought back one of the main playable characters from the original Resident Evil, Jill Valentine, as the main playable character once again. One of its unique features is that Jill would be constantly stalked by a more agile and scary version of Mr. X called Nemesis, and it would be called Resident Evil Nemesis. Meanwhile, Resident Evil 3 production began and Capcom decided it would be developed for the new generation of consoles, more specifically for the Sega Dreamcast. However, Capcom also wanted to make the Resident Evil trilogy available on the PlayStation. There were some rumors that Capcom had some legal contract with Sony that forced them to release Resident Evil 3 on the PlayStation, but those were probably just rumors. Regardless, what happened in the end is that the spin-off Resident Evil Nemesis got the number 3 stamped on it, and what was originally supposed to be Resident Evil 3 got called Resident Evil Code Veronica, aka the only mainline Resident Evil that doesn't have a number, unless you include the Resident Evil Revelations games in the mainline, but we'll get to that. 1 year after Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is released. Right at the beginning of the game, Brad Vickers dies and Jill Valentine then teams up with some mercenaries that were hired by Umbrella in order to rescue the civilians of Raccoon City, or so they were told, since actually Umbrella just wanted to test the efficacy of POWs against trained soldiers, and only a few of them were hired to actually gather the data. At the middle of the game, Jill gets infected with the T-virus by Nemesis, but her mercenary companion Carlos manages to get a vaccine for her, and trust me, this will be relevant later, but we'll get to that. At the end, both Jill and Carlos get rescued by Barry Burton, who is also one of the protagonists of the first game, just in time so they can witness a nuke being dropped in Raccoon City, putting an end to the place that served as the central location of the original Resident Evil trilogy. After you beat the game, you unlock an epilogue, which is a paragraph of text with a cool image. There are a total of 8 epilogues, each of them containing interesting information that could potentially be used in the sequels. Epilogue 1 shows Jill arriving at Chris's hideout and finding it empty, except for the knife on the floor. The image also shows that there is blood on the floor, implying that Chris might have been involved in a confrontation in his hideout, and then was forced to flee. Epilogue 2 shows Chris having some tea at a cafe or somewhere similar. He's writing a letter to Claire and it's implied that he's constantly thinking about his sister, but a short time later he discovers that Claire was looking for him and got caught. Epilogue 3 shows Barry with his family. This epilogue is a throwback to the events of Resident Evil 1, when Barry had betrayed his teammates, and it is implied that he is leaving his family to go help Jill and Chris as a way to repay their forgiveness. Epilogue 4 shows Leon talking to a government official, who offers him a deal in exchange for Sherry Birkin's safety. Epilogue 5 shows the events that happened right after the end of Resident Evil 2, when Claire got separated from Leon and Sherry in order to keep looking for her brother. Epilogue 6 shows Sherry under the custody of an army officer and it implies that she longs for Claire's return. Epilogue 7 confirms that Ada had survived the Raccoon City incident, though she's got a scar to remind her of what happened there. Despite the events in Raccoon City, she keeps working as a secret agent, but those events clearly left not only a physical scar, but an emotional one as well, as it's made clear by her tears. This epilogue also implies that Ada Wong was never her real name, but only a name used during her mission in Raccoon City. However, this detail was abandoned by the developer since she keeps being called Ada Wong in the following games, which is understandable considering that that's how the players knew her. And finally, Epilogue 8 shows Hunk inside a chopper, probably right after his escape from Raccoon City, and it implies that Hunk had a history of being the sole survivor in his missions. As we are going to see in the rest of the video, some of the ideas on those epilogues got somewhat used in the next games, while others weren't. Now, in between the releases of RE3 and Code Veronica, there was another Resident Evil game, the spin-off Gun Survivor. Basically, this was the first attempt to make a first-person Resident Evil game. The game isn't bad in my opinion, but it's definitely a weak entry compared to the rest of the series. The story is set 1 month after the events of Resident Evil 2 at Sheena Island, an island that was basically run by the Umbrella Corporation, and it even had a town full of civilians. Of course, there were Umbrella laboratories on the island, and the T-virus once again leaked, turning most of the island's population into zombies. The main connection to the previous games is the protagonist, Ark Thompson, an investigator who infiltrated the island after getting a tip from his friend, who is the protagonist of Resident Evil 2, Leon Kennedy. Because of the Outbreak, Sheena Island would gain the reputation as the second Raccoon City, but the events of Resident Evil Survivor pretty much got forgotten by the rest of the series. The next game was my personal favorite, Resident Evil Code Veronica, which was released in the year 2000. Set 3 months after the events of RE2 and 3, Code Veronica follows Claire Redfield, who infiltrated the Paris HQ of Umbrella while searching for her brother Chris, but then got captured and brought to Rockfort Island, which serves as a prison island for Umbrella's enemies. In this game, we get a lot more information about Umbrella's history, more specifically about the company's connection to the Ashford family of aristocrats. The Ashford family was founded by the beautiful genius Veronica, and one of her descendants, Edward Ashford, founded Umbrella alongside his partners Oswald Spencer and James Marcus. However, Edward's son Alexander was not a researcher as talented as his father, so in an attempt to compensate for that, he manipulated his own genes in order to quote-unquote resurrect the intellect of Veronica within his children, who happened to be twins. The male twin, Alfred, only had above-average intelligence, while the female twin, Alexia, was an outstanding genius. Alexia went on to create the T Veronica virus, which is a combination of the T virus and the genes of ants, which would allow for an individual to be the quote-unquote queen who orders the other individuals infected by the virus, similar to how the queen ant orders the worker ants. Alexia uses her own father to experiment the T Veronica virus, but he only became a monster, and thus she concludes that the virus needs 15 years of maturation within the host, so she infects herself with the virus and enters into cryogenic sleep. Coincidence or not, the events of Code Veronica happen exactly 15 years later, when Alexia's brother Alfred is acting as the commander of Rockfort Island. Much like what happened with the G virus, the T Veronica virus doesn't get much use later in the series, with a few exceptions of course, but we'll get to that. Some other very important plot points that happen in Code Veronica are the much-awaited reunion of the siblings Chris and Claire Redfield, as well as the comeback of Albert Wesker, who had supposedly died at the end of RE1 and would eventually become the most memorable antagonist in the series. Wesker's revival was most certainly a retcon, one of many to come by the way, and it's the target of many criticisms from some of the fans. But in my opinion, it's forgivable solely due to the fact that it's thanks to this retcon that Wesker became one of the most iconic video game villains ever. But how was Wesker revived after being impaled by the Tyrant at the end of RE1? The game doesn't give any explanation to how that's even possible, nor to why Wesker has demonic eyes and superpowers now. Instead, it assumes a stance that says to just don't think too hard about it. Another important detail is that in Code Veronica, Wesker is not working for Umbrella anymore, but actually to one of Umbrella's competitors, which is simply referred to as the Organization. But what organization is that? Well, the series never revealed the name of the organization and later just dropped them out of the plot,
so don't think too hard about it. Also, Code Veronica's director is apparently a big fan of the Titanic from James Cameron. Considering that Code Veronica was originally supposed to be Resident Evil 3, that concludes what was supposed to be the original Resident Evil trilogy. So what happens next? That's when the series starts to lose its focus and Capcom starts putting out a lot of spin-offs. In the next year, Capcom produced a sequel to Gun Survivor for the arcade, which was actually a first-person adaptation of the first half of Resident Evil Code Veronica, although it's later revealed that the whole game was just a dream Claire had after the end of Code Veronica. This game was later ported to the PlayStation 2. The next game to be released was Resident Evil Gaiden for the Game Boy Color. The protagonists of this game are Leon Kennedy from RE2 and Barry Burton from RE1, who are both members of an anti-Umbrella organization. Leon is sent to investigate an ocean liner called Starlight, which apparently got infested with BOWs, and Barry Burton is sent to search for him after Leon lost radio contact with HQ. This game isn't considered canon, it is said to take place in an alternative timeline from the mainline games. Now, the next Resident Evil game wasn't headed for the PlayStation 2, it was actually being produced for the Nintendo GameCube. This next game was not a sequel, however. Neither it was a spin-off nor a prequel. In 2002, the Resident Evil remake came out. Its new engine was the combination of the fixed camera style, and to this day it is considered one of the most visually beautiful Resident Evil games alongside Zero, which used the same engine. For the most part, the game is a retelling of RE1 with better graphics, but a lot of new content was added, including new locations and monsters, most notably Lisa Trevor, an enemy with a very tragic backstory and who is also immortal, so instead of being killed in the game, she just jumped into a very deep hole and disappeared. Later in the same year, Resident Evil Zero came out, also for the Nintendo GameCube. This is the first prequel to be made for the series and it tells the story of what happened to the STARS Bravo team one day prior to the events of RE1. A passenger train called the Spencer Express went missing while passing through the Arklay Mountains, so Bravo team is sent to investigate. During the game you control two characters, STARS medic and rookie member Rebecca Chambers, as well as Billy Cohen, an ex-soldier fugitive that got condemned to the death penalty under the accusation of having killed 23 people. Rebecca and Billy meet by coincidence while they were aboard the Spencer Express, which apparently had been attacked by BOWs. But then the train starts moving and they have no choice but to work together in order to escape from this predicament, which was later revealed to have been caused by the resurrected James Marcus, one of the three founders of Umbrella, who had been assassinated due to some power struggle within the company, and after reviving as a leech monster, he decided to take revenge on Umbrella. This game also connects to the plots of RE1 and RE2 by having a scene of both Albert Wesker and William Birkin conspire behind the scenes. After the events of the game, Billy goes missing and Rebecca heads to the Spencer Mansion, where the events of RE1 take place. Now RE0 uses the classic fixed camera and tank controls from the early Resident Evil games, but it also implemented some very interesting original ideas, most notably the zapping system, in which you can swap between the two main characters at almost any moment by simply pressing a button, as well as the abandonment of the classic magical item box to make place for an item dropping system, in which you can drop the items from your inventory on the ground and retrieve them from that same location at any time. Although those were very interesting ideas on paper, they weren't so fun when executed, and the fans gave negative feedback because of them, which explains why they were never used again. Fun fact, this game was probably always supposed to be released on a Nintendo platform, since there's footage of an early version that was being developed for the Nintendo 64. The next game came out in 2003, and that's Resident Evil Dead Aim, also known as Gun Survivor 4. Yes, you heard that right, it's Gun Survivor 4, not 3. The reason for that is because Gun Survivor 3 was not part of the Resident Evil series. Instead, it was a spin-off of the Dino Crisis series, which got named Dino Stalker in the West. So basically, Gun Survivor isn't a Resident Evil spin-off series. It is the series of Capcom's first-person shooter survival horror games, which happens to have 3 games set in the Resident Evil universe and 1 game set in the Dino Crisis universe. But anyway, Back to that aim. This game was developed by Cavia, the same team that would later create Drakengard and Nier, and instead of adapting the events of a previous game, like Gun Survivor 2, it follows the example of Gun Survivor 1 and depicts a completely original story that, although connected to the Resident Evil overarching story, is so separate from the rest that its existence is never recognized in any of the other games. It also follows the Gun Survivor tradition of being a decent game that completely pales in comparison to the mainline series, but this one specifically got a little bit of a cult following because of its unique style and cool noir-esque mood, for lack of a better term,
as well as a cast of characters who are actually likable and decently well written. The story is set in 2002 in a cruise ship called the Spencer Reign, a reference to Oswald Spencer, who at the time is the sole owner of Umbrella. The ship was hijacked by the game's antagonist, a terrorist called Morpheus Duval. Morpheus is an ex-Umbrella employee, was fired for being the one responsible for the virus leak in the Arklay Mountains. So that's a very interesting connection to the first game right there. The US government's
agent Bruce McGivern is then sent to the ship to stop Duval, and because China is also being threatened by Duval, the Chinese government also sends an agent, Feng Ling, and the two of them have to team up against Morpheus. At that time, it was the early 2000s. We had already gotten Phantasy Star Online on the Dreamcast, and other online games for PC like RuneScape and Counter-Strike were also popular. In other words, it was the beginning of the online gaming era. The PlayStation 2 had also received a network adapter peripheral, so it was only a matter of time before Capcom decided to try their hand into online gaming as well. Their first game with online capabilities was Capcom vs SNK 2 EO, but soon they would also try something using the Resident Evil franchise, and that would be Resident Evil Outbreak, released in 2003. Though it was created primarily to be an online game, it was also possible to play its campaign offline. The events of the game took place during the Raccoon City virus outbreak, so it happens in parallel to Resident Evil 2 and 3. This time, you can choose your playable character from a roster of 8 Raccoon City civilians, each one with unique traits and abilities. You had Kevin Ryman, the police officer who starts the campaign with a gun, David King, a mechanic/plumber who can fix broken items, Mark Wilkins, a war veteran working for a security company who has greater physical strength, George Hamilton, a doctor from the Raccoon City Hospital who can create healing items, Cindy Lennox, a waitress who is good at keeping calm, avoiding attacks, and has extra inventory space for healing items, Yoko Suzuki, a college student and computer nerd who worked at William Birkin's secret lab and who could carry more items thanks to her backpack, Gene Chapman, a Raccoon City subway employee who has good luck, and Alyssa Ashcroft, a newspaper reporter who can use the lockpick. Remember this character, she's important, but we'll get to that. In this game you can play through different scenarios, each of them displaying cutscenes that usually involve one of the main characters. In the following year, Capcom would release Resident Evil Outbreak File 2, which is essentially a bunch of new scenarios for Resident Evil Outbreak. Basically, Capcom had to launch a whole separate game because DLC wasn't a thing at the time. Which is funny considering that Capcom would later fall in love with the concept of DLC, but I digress.
So, during the early 2000s, the Resident Evil series got a bunch of spin-offs, a remake and a prequel. But where was the next mainline game? Where was Resident Evil 4? Well, Resident Evil 4's development went through a lot of changes. An early development demo for the GameCube, which fans would later call Resident Evil 3.5, was made, and it featured Leon Kennedy in a haunted castle. There were no zombies in the game, and Leon apparently had to deal with hallucinations caused by a virus he got infected with. He also had to run away from a stalker enemy called the Hookman. The many different ideas of what Resident Evil 4 could be ended up being turned into different games, and apparently the only part of the original idea that ended up being preserved in all of those games was the castle setting. Hideki Kamiya wanted to make a game full of stylized action, but because the vibe became too unrecognizable from that of a Resident Evil game, it ended up becoming its own original IP, called Devil May Cry. Meanwhile, a different game director combined what Resident Evil 4 could be with elements of the then defunct Clock Tower series, and created Hunting Ground. But in the end, it was Shinji Mikami, the creator of the original Resident Evil, who took the reins of the series once again and went on to create what could be considered the second most influential game in the series. Remember when I said that there was an exception to the rule of having a different director for each mainline Resident Evil game? That's right, the exception is Shinji Mikami, who created both RE1 and RE4, which is ironic since RE4 is often blamed as the game responsible for changing the essence of Resident Evil from a series of horror-oriented games to a series of action-oriented games. Resident Evil 4 was released in 2005, and its plot takes place in 2004. Right at the intro cutscene, the game establishes that Umbrella went bankrupt the year prior, and then the game starts with Leon Kennedy, who is now a US government agent working under the direct orders of the president. Ashley Graham, the president's daughter, got abducted, and Leon is sent to the countryside of Spain to rescue her. During the game, Leon finds out that the ones responsible for Ashley's abduction were a religious cult called Los Iluminados, which means the Enlightened Ones in Spanish, and whose members are all infected with a parasite called Las Plagas, which means the plagues in Spanish. So for the first time in the series, the enemies are not infected with a virus, but rather with a parasite. This brought some interesting changes, not only for the lore, but also for the gameplay, since the parasites can make some new and unique mutations, and the player can use their weaknesses against a strong light, which is the reason why the tentacle enemies only show up at night. Ada Wong and Albert Wesker also come back in RE4, showing that the game makes use of the loose ends left by RE2, Code Veronica, and some of the epilogues from RE3. At the end of the game, Ada takes a sample of Las Plagas to Albert Wesker, leaving the possibility of having the same types of enemies from this game in the next ones. In 2006, a remake of RE1 called Deadly Silence was released for the Nintendo DS. Then in 2007, the Nintendo Wii got the Resident Evil Umbrella Chronicles, which is a non-rails first-person shooter, similar to the House of the Dead games. This game retells the events of RE0, RE1, and RE3, and also presents us with a few original side stories. The entire game focuses on Wesker's perspective of the events, and it provides us with explanations to many questions that were left unanswered by the previous games. Like, how did Wesker come back to life after being impaled by the tyrant at the end of RE1? Umbrella Chronicles shows that before Chris/Jill showed up in the lab to confront him, he had injected himself with an experimental virus that would later revive him and also grant him superhuman abilities and freaky eyes. Then after reviving, he had to quickly make his escape from the mansion before it exploded, which probably happened at the same time Chris and Jill were fighting against the tyrant on the rooftop. Or how did Ada survive after the events of RE2? Apparently she got severely wounded, but still managed to escape from Raccoon City before the place was nuked. The last scenario of the game also shows both how the BSAA started and how Umbrella went bankrupt. The Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, or BSAA, is an anti-bioterrorist global organization that was assembled mainly because Umbrella was selling bioweapons to terrorist groups, and the members of STARS, Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, and Barry Burton, were among their first members. Chris and Jill are sent on a mission to infiltrate an Umbrella facility in 2003, and their success was the final blow that finally finished Umbrella. So we can see that Umbrella Chronicles was more of an attempt to tie up the loose ends left by the series, rather than opening up new possibilities. Another important feature that was first added to the Resident Evil series through this game was local co-op. In 2008, we got the first Resident Evil CGI movie that exists in the same universe as the games, Resident Evil Degeneration. This movie brings back the protagonists from Resident Evil 2, Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield. Claire became a member of a human rights agency called TerraSave, which is dedicated to giving assistance to victims of bioterrorism. In the beginning of the movie, she is in an American airport, but all of a sudden, an airplane crashes and the place gets infested with zombies. So the government sends a group of operatives led by a specialist in combat against BOWs, Leon Kennedy. By the way, Degeneration takes place in 2005, 1 year after the events of RE4, but I have no idea what happened to Leon over the span of 1 year, because the witty and laid-back Leon we see in RE4 becomes an overly serious and professional man in Degeneration. Although I guess Leon never really had a consistent personality across the series. But anyway, after Claire and Leon reunite, the group manages to clear the airport and the two characters proceed to investigate the incident. In the end, the villain injects himself with the G-Virus, meaning that the Hunk storyline from RE2 eventually got used for something, even if it was only a CGI movie produced 10 years after the game. This movie also got a game adaptation for an old Nokia phone called the N-Gage. The game had impressive graphics for a mobile game from 2008, and it played similar to RE4, but with zombies instead of ganado. The next mainline Resident Evil game would only come out in 2009 for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. In Resident Evil 5, we see the return of Chris Redfield as the main protagonist, but this time he is in Central Africa, and he's accompanied by a new character, a local agent called Sheva Alomar, who, just like Chris, is also a member of the BSAA, the organization that was introduced in Umbrella Chronicles. Chris and Sheva are trying to track down an arms dealer called Irving, who recently had been dealing bioweapons that were also used to infect the local people, who present the same symptoms of the Las Plagas infected from RE4, but this time they are infected with a new lab-produced variant of the parasite, called Ouroboros. Chris and Sheva eventually find out that the one behind the use of bioweapons in Africa is none other than Albert Wesker, who once again plays the role of main antagonist in this game. Wesker was now in command of a new pharmaceutical company called Tricell, and no, Tricell is not the organization he mentioned in Code Veronica. What happened to that organization? Well, the plot forgot it, so don't think too hard about it. But not only was Wesker now the boss of a new company, he also had brainwashed Jill Valentine and made her work for him, which came as a surprise to Chris, who thought his old partner had died years before after the two of them had infiltrated Oswald Spencer's mansion. No, not the one that exploded, the one in Europe. Coincidence or not, Jill and Chris had only arrived after Wesker had already murdered Spencer. Oh yeah, Spencer died by the way. So all of the Umbrella founders were now officially dead. Thankfully, Chris and Sheva managed to free Jill from the mind control jewel on her chest, and at the end of the game, Wesker dies once and for all after falling into a volcano and getting 2 RPG missiles blasted on his face, putting an end to Umbrella's legacy once and for all. Or so we thought. The game also mentions both the G-Virus and the T-Veronica virus, but they don't impact the story in any meaningful way. Despite becoming the best-selling Resident Evil game ever, RE5 received criticism for completely abandoning horror for the sake of action. Before the game came out, the developers were saying that the new concept brought by RE5 would be horror in light, or something like that. The idea was that the locations would be so bright that you wouldn't be able to discern well what might be coming towards you. But in the end, that didn't happen, and the illuminated environments just didn't work. That does not mean that RE5 is a bad game, however. It's actually an extremely fun and well-polished third-person shooter action game, and its most notable feature was the co-op. If you play the game in single-player mode, the character of Sheva is going to be controlled by the game's AI, which is questionable to say the least. So the ideal way to experience RE5 is definitely playing co-op with a friend. Later the same year, Capcom released Resident Evil Darkside Chronicles for the Wii, another on-rails first-person shooter that serves as a spiritual sequel to Umbrella Chronicles. But this time, it focuses on Leon and Claire's side of the story. The game retells the events of RE2 and Code Veronica, and also features an original scenario called Operation Javier, which features Leon and Jack Krauser, aka one of the villains from RE4, but before he became a villain. Maybe I forgot to mention this when talking about RE4, but one of the bosses of the game was Krauser, who used to be Leon's partner as a US government agent. And in that game, it's mentioned that Krauser was thought to have died in an explosion 2 years prior. So Darkside Chronicles ties up that loose end by giving an explanation to what had happened to Krauser in the year 2002. In Operation Javier, Leon and Krauser are sent to the Amazon forest to track down a South American dealer called Javier, who has been dealing bioweapons. During the operation, they encounter a girl called Manuela, who apparently has similar powers to Alexia Ashford, thanks to the T. Veronica virus. So this game not only borrows the character of Krauser from RE4, but it also borrows the T. Veronica virus from Code Veronica. In 2011, the game Resident Evil The Mercenaries 3D was released for the Nintendo 3DS. The Mercenaries is a bonus mode first featured in RE3, which focuses on killing the biggest number of enemies you can within a time limit. But the formula of this mode was actually refined to its current and more iconic state in RE4, and was also included in RE5. This 3DS game is basically the Mercenaries modes from RE4 and 5 put together in a single game. The next game to be released would also come out for the 3DS, but in 2012. Resident Evil Revelations. The concept of Revelations was to be a game that reveals stuff that happened before the last mainline game in the series, which was Resident Evil 5. The gameplay is over the shoulder, like RE4 and 5. Another unique aspect of this game is that it's presented in episodes, evoking the style of a TV series. The story takes place 4 years before RE5, and it starts with Jill Valentine and another BSAA member called Parker investigating a cruise liner where Chris Redfield and another character called Jessica had gone missing. As the story progresses, it is revealed that 1 year before there was a bioterrorist attack at a city called Terra Grigia, and it resulted in the complete obliteration of the city. Just so it happens that the characters Parker, Jessica, and Raymond, this is Raymond by the way, were all survivors from Terra Grigia. The game ends with Chris and Jill going to the Spencer estate where they confront Wesker and Jill goes missing, as shown in the RE5 flashbacks and DLC. But it also has a post-credit scene showing that Jessica and Raymond are alive and doing something suspicious, which opens up possibilities for new games to reuse those characters. Though that never happened, and it likely never will. In the same year, Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City was released. It is an action-focused third-person shooter set in Raccoon City during the events of RE2 and RE3. The protagonists are a group of Umbrella secret operatives, and since this game completely overwrites the plots of RE2 and 3, it isn't canon. But still in 2012, yet another Resident Evil game was released. You know, if you think about it, RE5 was the perfect place to end the series. The hero from the first game finally defeats the big villain of the series, who also happens to be the antagonist of the first game. And most of the loose ends had already been tied up thanks to the Chronicles games. However, Resident Evil 5 was the best-selling Resident Evil game of all time, and Capcom could not ignore that fact, so it shouldn't be a surprise that Resident Evil 6 was made. But oh boy. Operation Raccoon City was bad, but nobody cared because it was a side game. RE6 is the black sheep of the mainline entries. It was supposed to be the biggest game in the series so far, and it technically is, since it has the longest playtime when you add all of its 4 separate campaigns. But that only means that the torture lasts even longer if you want to see it all through. Some of the complaints regarding the last games were that they weren't scary enough, because of stuff like the ganado and having the game set during the day. But RE6 decided to fix that, so they brought zombies back. Great. And the game is set at night. Also great. But then they took all of the action gameplay from the previous games and cranked it up to 11. And they also added explosive action sequences on par with Michael Bay movies. And they added a story that makes absolutely no sense. The overall plot is that someone created a new virus called the C virus. And why is the C virus different from any of the other viruses in the games? It isn't clear, so just don't think too hard about it. As I mentioned before, in this game you got 4 campaigns. First there is Leon's campaign, in which he's accompanied by Elena. The story begins with Leon being forced to shoot his boss, aka the President of the United States, who apparently managed to get re-elected but then turned into a zombie. He then joins up with Elena, some stuff happens, they get on a plane, there are zombies in the plane falls, and they miraculously arrive in the eastern coast of China. But oh no, there's a C-virus outbreak in China too. Then they find out who the villain is. I guess his name is Simmons. Simmons turns into a dinosaur, the guy dies after being impaled and having his blood create the logo of Umbrella by a complete coincidence, and oh, I forgot to say that Ada shows up. Then we have Chris's campaign, in which he's accompanied by Pierce. In this side of the story, we find out that Chris got promoted to captain of a BSAA squadron, but Ada shows up when they were on a mission in Eastern Europe and kills all of his men except for Pierce. Chris then becomes a depressed alcoholic, but Pierce shows up, tells him to get his act together, and they go to China. In the end, Pierce gets infected with something, and because of that he gets lightning powers, which is actually one of the coolest things in the game, so don't think too hard about it. Pierce sacrifices himself to save Chris, and that's the end of the story. Then we have Jake's campaign. But who is Jake, you might be asking? Well, he is the illegitimate son of none other than Albert Wesker, and he is accompanied by Sherry Birkin, the little girl from RE2 who is now working for the US government, just like Leon. Sherry was sent to track down Jake because his blood has the cure for the C-virus. Now, why does his blood have the cure for a completely new virus? Well, maybe this new virus has something to do with the virus that gave Wesker his superpowers, despite the fact that Jake was born way before Wesker got his superpowers. Actually, just don't think too hard about it. What happens is that they both are in Eastern Europe, but then they end up in China and the rest is history. Finally, there is Ada's campaign. Ada constantly appears in the other campaigns just to mess with the other characters and basically be a villain. But in this campaign, we learn that the evil Ada who was messing with everybody is not the real Ada. It's actually her clone, Carla, who is doing all the evil stuff. Except that Carla is not really a clone. She's actually the secretary of Simmons, that Simmons forcefully turned into an identical copy of Ada because the guy is just obsessed with Ada, so Carla decided to unleash the C-virus in 3 different continents so that she would get revenge on Simmons for forcibly changing her appearance. And that's the plot of Resident Evil 6. Oh, and there's also an Illuminati-like organization called the Family involved, but don't think too hard about it. Overall, RE6 was a disaster, but we got to give credit where credit is due. The only part of the game that came close to being scary was the beginning of Leon's campaign. Helena was a decent character and the plotline about her sister was tragic and interesting. The best part of the game was definitely the character of Pierce, and his last moments were both tragic and cool. In fact, Pierce was such a good character that he even got a side story in the form of a manga. In the end, none of the next games used any of the threads left behind by RE6, and rather just completely ignored its existence. And we should all be thankful for that. Still in 2012, something far better than both Operation Raccoon City and RE6 came out, the CGI movie Resident Evil Damnation. Leon is once again brought back as the protagonist for this movie, and this time he's sent to a fictional Eastern European country that's being torn apart by BOWs. There, Leon meets and teams up with Buddy, a local who somehow got the ability to control leakers. These are the leakers, by the way, they are enemies who first appeared in RE2. Oh, and Ada also has an active role in the movie. For the most part, the movie is an excuse for having cool action scenes, but the story isn't so bad, so I guess it's worth watching. Now the next game came out in 2015, and that was Resident Evil Revelations 2. It can be seen as a sequel to the first Revelations game for a number of reasons. First, it preserves the concept of revealing the events that happened before the previous mainline game, which in this case would be RE6. It also features the same episodic storytelling reminiscent of a TV series, and it also brings back the Terra Grigia disaster plotline to the story. Set more or less 1 year before the events of RE6, Revelations 2 brings back Claire Redfield as the lead protagonist, and this time she's accompanied by Moira Burton, who is one of the daughters of Barry Burton and just became a new member of TerraSave, the human rights agency introduced in Resident Evil Degeneration. The 2 female leads are participating in a special gathering for TerraSave members when a mysterious armed group breaks in and abducts them. When they wake up, they are trapped in a prison island, somewhat reminiscent of the beginning of Code Veronica. But the catch is that all the TerraSafe members that were abducted got infected with a new virus that only spreads if the host is affected by fear. After finding out that his daughter went missing, Barry also goes to the island to look for her, but when he arrives, he meets a young girl called Natalia, who happens to be a survivor from the Terra Grigia incident, and who also has the mysterious ability to sense the presence of individuals infected with the new virus. As the story progresses, it is revealed that the one responsible for the series of events is Alex Wesker, who is Albert Wesker's sister. Alex's goal is to gain a certain kind of immortality by somehow transferring her consciousness to a new body, which happens to be the body of Natalia. But why was it necessary to abduct people from TerraSave? Don't think too hard about it. In the end, Alex is defeated by the protagonists, but in the post-credits scene it's suggested that Alex actually managed to accomplish her goal and her soul now lies within Natalia, who ended up being adopted by Barry's family, which opens up a new plot device that could be used in future installments. Similar to RE5, Revelations 2 also relies heavily on its two-player co-op mode, but while in RE5 you had both players blasting the enemies with a variety of weapons, now only one of the players could use guns, while the second player is delegated to using different game mechanics, like blinding enemies with a flashlight or finding hidden items. Then in 2016, Capcom released Resident Evil Umbrella Corps, an online multiplayer competitive game which is basically Resident Evil's version of Counter-Strike, but nobody cared about it. After this, Resident Evil seemed to have lost its way. The series had diverged too much from its horror origins, and although Revelations 2 was a good game, it still was a spin-off far from what people expected from a new mainline entry. But for everyone's surprise, a new Resident Evil was announced, and it was completely different from what everyone had imagined it could be. Resident Evil 7 was released in 2017, and it featured new characters, new enemies, and a new gameplay style. This time, Resident Evil was in first-person perspective. Sure, we had already seen that perspective in the Gun Survivor side games, and also in the Chronicles games, but never in a mainline entry. The main reason for this change was so that RE7 could be played as a VR game, and to this day it is considered one of, if not the best, VR horror experience. But this new entry wasn't exciting only because of its new features. It also brought back classic elements from the first games, like a greater focus on survival horror, a scary ambience in a confined space, backtracking, limited resources, and the most important, it once again put the player in the shoes of a vulnerable character who needs to use his wits to survive instead of a super soldier performing bombastic action. In other words, RE7 gave fans everything they were asking for. Its plot is set in 2017 and it follows a new protagonist, Ethan Winters, whose wife, Mia, went missing 3 years before. Then one day, he gets an email from her, revealing that she was in the countryside of Louisiana. While looking for her, Ethan ends up in the house of the Baker family, but for his surprise, the members of the family as well as Mia had all mutated into unique kinds of monsters, as a consequence of being infected, not by a virus, not by a parasite, but this time by mold. As the game progresses, it is revealed that his wife was secretly working with the development of new bioweapons, and she had been tasked with the job of taking care of Evelyn, a small girl turned into a bioweapon who has the power to control the mold. Evelyn gets out of control while being transported on a boat, so the boat is destroyed and both Evelyn and Mia are rescued by the Bakers, who were initially a pretty normal family. But Evelyn infects the family and controls their minds, forcing them to treat her as their new daughter, and Mia also ended up being infected and forced to be part of the family. One of the interesting things about this game is that it's also an homage to classical horror movies, since each one of the family members, who are also the game's bosses, are references to different horror movie genres. The father, Jack, is inspired by slasher movies, like Friday the 13th and Halloween. The mother, Margaret, is inspired by body horror, like in John Carpenter's The Thing. The son, Lucas, is inspired by the psychological type of horror seen in movies like Saw. And Evelyn herself is inspired by ghost horror, like The Grudge and The Calling. In the game, the player can find a file written by Alyssa Ashcroft, the reporter from Resident Evil Outbreak, and in the very last scene, Ethan is rescued by the series' main protagonist, Chris Redfield, who is now working with Blue Umbrella. Wait, Chris is working with Umbrella? No, he's working with Blue Umbrella. Basically, the old Umbrella got split up into two factions, the Red and Blue Umbrella, with Blue being good and Red being bad. And why did that happen? It happened so that the game could have a link with Umbrella Corps, that no one cared about. But didn't Umbrella go bankrupt before RE4? And wasn't Chris working with the BSAA? Just don't think too hard about it. The good news is, Resident Evil was back after a long period of disappointments and Resident Evil 7 was received with a lot of praise. One of the reasons why this was possible was thanks to the new RE engine, which would be used to develop the next games in the series and even other Capcom titles, like Devil May Cry 5 and Monster Hunter Wilds.
Most of the hardcore Resident Evil fans were very thankful for RE7 bringing the series back to its horror roots. But Capcom knew that there were some people out there that actually enjoyed the bombastic action from games like RE4, 5 and 6. So to honor those guys, another CGI movie called Resident Evil Vendetta was also released in 2017. Much like Damnation, Vendetta had pretty cool action sequences, but this time the story was really bad. The protagonists of this movie are Leon, Chris and Rebecca, who hasn't appeared in the series ever since RE0, or RE1 if you prefer to think within the series chronology. Chris is the captain of a squadron that gets sent to a mansion to apprehend a bioweapons dealer called Glenn Arias. But Glenn, who somehow found a way to control the infected so that they would know the difference between friend and foe, traps the squadron and then annihilates it,
making Chris the only surviving member, who then swears to take revenge. So basically, it's a repetition of the exact same character arc Chris went through in RE6. But in order to stop Glenn, he needs the help of Leon, who for some random reason became an alcoholic, and also Rebecca. The actions of the antagonist, Glenn, are motivated by the loss of his wife, who died when their wedding literally got bombed, so he concluded that becoming a bioweapons dealer is going to solve his grief problem. Don't think too hard about it. Coincidence or not, Rebecca probably reminded of Glenn of his dead wife, so he decided to abduct her and turn her into his new wife. I told you the story was bad. I guess you can just watch the action scenes on YouTube and get the best of the experience without having to watch the whole movie. But I have to mention that at the end of the movie, it's shown that this blonde female antagonist that was working for Glenn managed to survive, and that is left on purpose as a loose end for a potential sequel. Then in 2019 we got the next Resident Evil games, which was the remake of Resident Evil 2 in the RE engine. This game was another huge success and it managed to balance just the right amount of new content and fidelity to the original. In the following year we got the Resident Evil 3 remake, which nicely made some connections to RE2 that weren't present in the original, but aside from that, this game wasn't so well received as the other remakes, mainly because there was a lot of cut content, since about 1/3 of the scenarios from the original ended up being removed in the remake. Another criticism that this game faced is that this game focused too much on bombastic action, while the original had a little bit more of horror and tension. I also have to mention that RE3 Remake retconned the nuclear bomb that was dropped in Raccoon City and replaced it by a thermal bomb. This is actually a relevant detail, but we'll get to that. Another online multiplayer Resident Evil game called Resistance was released alongside the Resident Evil 3 Remake. This time it features a group of players playing against a mastermind, but still nobody cared about it. Then in 2021 we got the 8th installment in the mainline series, Resident Evil Village. The protagonist is once again Ethan Winters from RE7, but this time the game is set in Romania and it features a snow horror style. After the events of RE7, Ethan and Mia receive military training from Chris Redfield and then move to Romania after they have a child, Rose Winters, in the year 2021. But one day, all of a sudden their house gets attacked by an armed group led by Chris, who kills Mia and knocks Ethan unconscious. When Ethan wakes up, he finds himself in a forest, and after some wandering, he arrives at a village that had been wiped out by werewolf-looking enemies. Ethan finds out that his daughter Rose had been abducted by Mother Miranda, the leader of a cult that controls the village. Apparently, Ethan had been infected by the mold in RE7. His DNA suffered enough change so that their daughter would be born with unique abilities. And it's because of those abilities that the baby becomes the target of the cult, since they want to utilize the baby for some sort of ritual. Ethan then has to rescue his daughter, but to do that he must defeat each of the leaders of the cult before finally confronting Mother Miranda. As the story progresses, it is revealed that Mother Miranda was actually a researcher who worked alongside Oswald Spencer, and that the mold featured in RE7 actually originated from this Romanian village, and that the umbrella logo was originally a symbol from this village's cult. Oh, and Chris shows up at the end to explain that he wasn't a bad guy, and that he didn't really kill Mia, it was all just a misunderstanding because there was no time to explain. Spoiler alert, Ethan dies at the end, so we won't be seeing him anymore. And at the very end of the game, Chris finds out that the BSAA is now using bioweapons that just happen to look like clones of Chris, which is obviously a loose end left on purpose to be utilized in potential sequels. Also, remember that RE7 paid homage to classical horror movie genres? Village does something similar, but this time referencing classic horror folktales. That's why the game features werewolves, vampires, a lake monster, Heisenberg is a reference to Dr. Frankenstein, and Miranda is obviously a witch. I heard some criticism from fans that didn't like that Resident Evil was diverging from quote-unquote scientific-based horror, but as a fan of folk horror myself, I absolutely loved the theme of Village. In the same year, we also got a CGI Netflix series called Resident Evil Infinite Darkness. The series is set in 2006, and the protagonists are once again the RE2 duo, Leon and Claire, who meet again when Claire pays a visit to the White House while working for TerraSave. The story revolves around a conspiracy about an incident involving an Army Special Operations unit in the year 2000. In 2022, we got another online multiplayer game, Resident Evil Reverse, which featured iconic locations and characters from across the series, and nobody cared about it. Then in 2023 we got Resident Evil 4 Remake, which got made by the same team that developed Resident Evil 2 and, once again, managed to find the perfect balance between new and classic. The end of the Separate Ways DLC is worth mentioning, as it might have hinted at a possible Resident Evil 5 remake. There was also another CGI movie released in 2023 called Resident Evil Death Island. What's remarkable about this movie is that for the first time all of the main protagonists of the series get united, including Chris, Jill, Leon, Claire and Rebecca. I guess only Barry was left out of this one. The story revolves around the heroes being brought to Death Island, where the villain unleashes BOWs because he got traumatized by the death of his friend in Raccoon City. His motivation is so dumb that even the characters say that in the movie. The movie is basically mindless action, just like Vendetta, but a few things worth mentioning is that Jill looks exactly like she does in RE3 Remake, which is set like 20 or so years before the movie. So how is it possible that she looks like this, despite being in her 40s? The answer is a retcon which established that because Jill got infected by Nemesis in RE3, her body stopped aging. This explanation got dubbed by the fans as the Young and Hot Forever virus. Also, that blonde female from Vendetta comes back in this movie and tries to get revenge for Glenn, but then she dies, tying up the loose end left by the previous movie. No new Resident Evil games would get released for the next 2 years, but at Summer Games Fest 2025, we finally got the announcement of the awaited Resident Evil 9, aka Resident Evil Requiem, and that's where we currently are at the moment of the making of this video. All we know from the announcement trailer is that the main protagonist of this next game, which is set to release in February of 2026, is Grace Ashcroft, the daughter of Alyssa Ashcroft from Resident Evil Outbreak. I told you we would get to that. Grace works for the FBI and she's investigating a case of mysterious deaths caused by an unknown disease. Her boss then tells her that another body was found and that the case is related to the Ramwood Hotel, the place where her mother, Alyssa, had died 8 years before. So right from the get-go, we know that Alisa is dead. Judging from the fact that we saw a file made by Alisa in RE7, which takes place in 2017, if we add up 8 years, then that means that Resident Evil Requiem takes place in at least 2025 and potentially later. The trailer then shows us images of the current state of the Raccoon City ruins, which means that the plot of the game will make direct connections to the events of the original trilogy as well as Resident Evil Outbreak. So it's important that the nuclear bomb was retconned to a thermal bomb, because what that means is that it's possible for the characters to go back to Raccoon City without the dangers of radiation. We can also hear a character that may or may not be the villain who captures Grace, talking about the fact that she is the chosen one.
I know now that you're the one that I've been searching for. The special one.
The explanation to this is likely the fact that in the events of Resident Evil Outbreak, Alisa got infected with a particular strain of the T-virus, but got cured by taking a special vaccine called Daylight. Grace most likely has inherited Daylight through her mother's DNA, and that's probably why the antagonist is after her. One of the enemies from the game is going to stalk Grace through the scenario, and a lot of people are saying that this monster looks like an overgrown Lisa Trevor. I wouldn't bet on that, given that the information we have is so limited. But it does make sense, considering that both the monster and Lisa wear chains on their wrists. And there's also the fact that Lisa never died, as she merely jumped into a hole and disappeared in RE1 Remake. But if that's the case, then it would imply that Lisa had mutated and grown over time.
But now, I'm going to talk about how the Resident Evil series has evolved and culminated into Resident Evil Requiem. First, let's talk about how the gameplay has evolved. The original game had fixed camera angles, tank controls, and it used pre-rendered backgrounds. This classic formula was reused in the next games and then perfected in RE1 Remake and RE0. Although Code Veronica had experimented with 3D environments rather than pre-rendered backgrounds, which, although not as beautiful as the background in the RE Remake and Zero, did allow for the implementation of the dynamic camera movement. All of those games also featured limited resources and had a heavy focus on item management. RE0 also experimented a bit with the removal of the item box and the zapping system, which might have been a precursor of co-op, but those systems were ultimately failures. The Gun Survivor games were a series of spin-offs that first introduced Resident Evil to the first-person perspective, but unfortunately, those were low-budget, mediocre games. And there was also Resident Evil Outbreak, which first introduced the series to online multiplayer. Then RE4 completely shifted the gameplay style adopted by the mainline entries. Instead of fixed camera angles, now the games would use a third-person over-the-shoulder perspective. The games would become more linear, and they also began using a chapter structure. Gameplay became much more focused in action rather than survival horror, and because enemies would drop items, item scarcity wasn't a thing anymore. QTEs were also added, and became part of the standard up to RE6. The Chronicles games originally released for the Wii were spin-offs that offered a totally different experience on the other hand, as they were on-rail first-person shooters. The Revelations games used for the most part the same gameplay mechanics from RE4, 5 and 6, but those games were a little bit slower and managed to evoke the horror feeling a little bit better. Those side games also were characterized by suspenseful and dramatic storytelling, paired up with an episode structure that emulated the experience of watching a TV series. Although co-op was first introduced in Umbrella Chronicles, it was RE5 that ultimately popularized this gameplay mode within the series, making it come back both in RE6 and Revelations 2. RE7 then introduced Capcom's new engine, the RE engine, which allowed for more photorealistic graphics. It introduced Resident Evil 2 VR, and it also brought the series back to its survival horror roots. Although the first-person perspective was technically introduced by Resident Evil Survivor, it was Resident Evil 7 that made it work within the series. So now we got an extremely scary and immersive survival horror experience with modern graphics and gameplay, but at the same time with the same classic mechanics of item management and backtracking. The developers were also mindful to make the gameplay coherent with the plot, so the game became much more action-oriented and the DLC where you play as the veteran Chris Redfield. Resident Evil Village was basically the successor of RE7 as it inherited most of its core innovations to the series, but it also mixed them with some elements of RE4, making it somewhat lean more to the action side of the series. And in parallel to RE7 and Village, the remakes of RE2, 3 and 4 were also released. They shared the same core elements like the third-person over-the-shoulder perspective, but with tight controls that made the characters feel vulnerable against the enemies, as it should be, and they all overall managed to strike a good balance between old and new. And finally we get to RE Requiem. It has been confirmed that this game can be played both in first-person and third-person perspective, which seems like a natural choice, given that RE7 and Village, which were first-person, were all being developed in parallel to the RE remakes, which were third-person. And there's also the fact that RE Village later got a DLC that allowed for the game to be played in third-person perspective. The gameplay seems to be heavily focused on puzzle solving and evading enemies rather than combat, which seems like an even more extreme survival horror style than RE7. Perhaps the most extreme we have seen so far. And given the fact that the game is told to be extremely scary, I think that's a good thing. Now let's talk about the evolution of the tone and feeling of the series. The original Resident Evil definitely inherited the core idea of its spiritual predecessor, Sweet Home, and went for a haunted house vibe, but it also has some of the cheesiness and flavor characteristic of old B-horror movies, which to many players is very endearing. RE2 retains some of the cheesiness and B-horror movie vibe from the original, but this time the environment is switched from a haunted house to a haunted city, or rather, an apocalyptic horror set in a city. RE3 has very similar vibes to RE2, but because of the umbrella Mercenaries, it has a little bit of a military feel, while RE2 is focused solely on the perspective of civilians trying to survive. While Code Veronica does preserve a lot of the horror vibes established in the previous games, it also marks the point where things begin to diverge from their roots. Because of the Ashford family, the game is permeated with an European aristocrat vibe, and while it does have a very good horror environments like the secret Ashford mansion, it's also the game where some of the craziest and more exaggerated aspects of the series start to be introduced. And the game also gets very melodramatic at times, which I personally enjoyed, but I think that's just me. Resident Evil Dead Aim is pretty much a wild card that has its own unique style, but the game is so separate from the rest of the series that the only reason it's worth mentioning is because of its uniqueness. RE4 then shifts much of the series' tone and turns it into a much more action-oriented vibe in settings that are reminiscent of medieval Europe, but it still has some scary elements, like some segments of the village at night and the regenerators. RE4 is also very cheesy, but it's a different type of cheesiness, the type that would more commonly recognize from action movies rather than horror ones. RE5 drops the cheesiness in favor of a much more serious tone, but ironically it also dropped the remaining horror that was left in the series for more action, and the urban environments reminded me of games like Call of Duty, while the African ruins sometimes reminded me of Uncharted or Tomb Raider. RE6 is a confusing mess that attempts to be serious, scary and exciting, but fails on all of those fronts. The Revelations games both have very serious and suspenseful tones, and as I already said many times, they emulate the feeling of watching a TV series. RE7 then goes back to the Haunted Mansion vibe and cheesiness from RE1, but it also has its own unique flavor, and is the best game in the series in evoking the feeling of watching a B-horror movie. RE Village tries its hand on snow horror, and also adopts some Eastern European medieval style that invokes the vibe of European folktales. And finally, we get to Resident Evil Requiem. If we look at the trailer, we can see that there's a lot of white and grey tones, which kind of reminds me of Silent Hill 2 and 4, that more heavily relied on the psychological side of Silent Hill. These environmental colors associated with cloudy weather often invoke ambiguous and somewhat depressing feelings, which makes me wonder if this new Resident Evil is going to lean more on this psychological/depressing side of horror. Considering that the title of the game is Requiem and that the main character apparently struggles with grief, I think that's very plausible. It's also very obvious that the game has an extremely serious tone. Apparently, the beginning of the game is set in a hospital or a psychiatric hospital. We still don't know for sure, but if it's the latter, it's also compatible with the theme of a more psychological style of horror. The physical environments are also very dark and reminiscent of RE7, which is a good thing for a horror game. And now, let's talk about the evolution of the real-world themes that inspired the Resident Evil games. The first games in the series all had Umbrella, a pharmaceutical company, as its main antagonist, and the most prevalent enemy type in the games are the zombies. So these two themes, an evil pharmaceutical multinational company and the undead, were basically synonymous with the Resident Evil series during its initial years. So let's start by talking about the zombies. Although in Resident Evil it's given a scientific explanation as to why these zombies exist, they have always been commonly associated with the supernatural. Zombies are basically the dead who came back from their graves to the world of the living, but not in a complete sense like a resurrection. They are merely reanimated corpses that lack a living spirit, and thus are incapable of thinking and communicating. The only thing that leads the zombies to act is the drive to consume flesh, nothing more. If we try to look at it a little bit through the symbolic sense, a zombie is someone who lacks the mind and acts completely driven by the impulse to consume. Resident Evil explains the cause of zombification as being an infection by a virus, which implies the danger of contamination. So what is scary isn't only that the zombies can kill you, it's also that they can make you one of them. Let me also remind you that the first Resident Evil games were produced and had their stories taking place in the 90s. In case you don't know, the 90s were overall considered a peaceful time. I'm not saying that there were no wars at all, but the Cold War had concluded in 1991, and most of the world, especially the United States, were able to calm down and breathe during this period. And what's the worst thing that can happen in times of peace? To have that peace disrupted. That's the main fear that can affect a society in peaceful times like in the 90s. And the Resident Evil games portray their characters dealing with exactly that kind of threat, as they had to fight against biological weapons that were secretly being developed. Also, don't you think it's a little odd that the main villain of this story is a pharmaceutical company? I mean, that's the kind of company that gives us our aspirins, antibiotics, and even shampoos. And the games themselves are aware of that. Well, pharmaceutical companies are dependent on a very specific field of research: science. More specifically, chemistry and biology. Despite Resident Evil's main genre category being horror, it's also a science fiction series, and as is common within the science fiction genre, it explores the potential dangers of science and technology. The series obviously doesn't say that science is bad, but actually that it can be used for bad when in the hands of the wrong people. Now consider this. What do you think can disrupt a time of peace other than a war? A pandemic. Our history shows that pandemics just sort of randomly appear from time to time, like the Black Death and the Spanish flu. But what if, thanks to our current level of science and technology, someone is able to actually engineer a pandemic on purpose and use it as a way to gain profit or for other evil intentions? Now hold on, I don't want to get into conspiracy theories, but if you stop and think about it, you realize that that's not impossible. And as we all know, some people might have such an extreme distrust of science and technology that it borders on fear. I'm not trying to justify some of those behaviors. All I'm saying is that this is a fear that exists, and it can be explored within the realm of fiction, as the Resident Evil series has been doing for quite some time. And there's also the detail that Umbrella is a company that seeks profit. The concept of an evil company that acts in the name of progress is not uncommon in science fiction either. take Cyberdyne systems from the Terminator, just to name an example. The main difference between Cyberdyne and Umbrella is basically their field of research. While Cyberdyne specializes in robotics and AI, Umbrella specializes in virology. I also would like to mention that it was a very funny coincidence that the Resident Evil 3 remake got released only a few months after the start of the 2020 pandemic. Watching the game's intro movie about a pandemic caused by an evil pharmaceutical company during the quarantine was definitely weird. All of the themes that I have mentioned so far are prevalent in all of the mainline games up to Code Veronica and RE0, but the peaceful times that characterized most of the 90s came to an end on September 11th, 2001. After the events that took place on that day, the whole world directed their attention to a new threat: terrorism. And we can clearly see how that influenced the development of the next mainline game in the series, Resident Evil 4. The first thing we see when we start playing RE4 is that Umbrella is now a thing of the past. The new antagonists are now a religious terrorist cult that is targeting the United States in order to spread their religion. While in the previous games we had to survive against zombies, which are basically reanimated corpses without a living spirit, now we are threatened by people infected with a parasite that does not remove their capacity for movement, thinking, or language, but it takes over their free will and forces them to act as is commanded by someone who is controlling them. In other words, the game makes us feel like we are being persecuted by a mob of fanatics. After RE4, all of the games up to RE6, as well as the Revelations games and the CGI movies, all focused on the fear of and fight against terrorism. Resident Evil 5 also touched on a topic that I find very interesting, by exploring the origins of the progenitor virus, which is the first virus discovered by Umbrella and that originated the T-virus. This virus was present in a specific flower that grew in some West African ruins. The local people, who were not aware of the existence of a virus, treated the flowers as mystical or sacred plants, since consuming them would result in mutations. While at first the series treated zombies as a consequence of the dangers of advanced science and technology, RE5 portrays the exact same danger as being caused by a natural element, which is even associated with non-scientific traditions like tribal mysticism and rituals. In this case, it's shown that the danger of scientific progress might not only be creating a new threat for us, but also be bringing back or reviving a threat that lies dormant in the underworld and is ironically located where human life itself started. So the very concepts of science and mysticism, new and ancient, as well as life and death, are all brought together by the progenitor virus. Resident Evil Village also does something similar by introducing the Megamycete, which is the cause of some supernatural occurrences like werewolves and vampires, while at the same time having a scientific explanation, and it also tied in with the origins of Umbrella. After the action-oriented over-the-shoulder generation of Resident Evil games, we got Resident Evil 7. And while the themes of both terrorism and corporate greed were also somewhat present in that game, the focus definitely shifted from global threats to a more personal type of horror. RE7 specifically showcased the scary elements of the interpersonal relationships within a family. What I mean by that is that the Baker family isn't terrifying only because they literally turn into monsters, and I actually believe that that's the weaker of the reasons why they are scary. What's most unsettling about them is the way they behave in the game, being aggressive to each other, calling each other names, and punishing the children. The Daughters DLC makes the connotations of domestic abuse even more explicit. Of course, there is a lot of reason as to why they act in this way, since they are infected by the mold and being controlled by Evelyn. But that's not the point. What the game is trying to reference is an extreme version of what an abusive family environment can be, and that is terrifying to basically any human being. Even if you want to take the lore reasons into consideration, there is still the fact that all the mess that's happening in the game is being caused by a girl who just wanted to feel loved. On top of that, there is also a beautiful love story, in which the hero must free his loved one from the pathological family in which she is trapped, so that they can escape together. RE Village preserves these more personal themes, but this time Mia, who is the mate, stays out of the picture for most of the time, and the focus is put on Rose, the child. The dollhouse section in particular explores the human anxieties related to having a child, and after Mia, who is the benevolent mother, gets out of the picture, the role of the mother is taken by Miranda, a witch, which is traditionally associated with the archetype of the devouring mother. So, this is basically how we can interpret the themes of the Resident Evil series. The original games revolved around corporate greed and the dangers of scientific and technological progress. Then, after RE4's development got influenced by 9/11, RE4 through 6 and the Revelations games focused on the threat of terrorism. Different from RE4, in which the influence is quite clear, I'm not sure about what could possibly have inspired the themes of RE7 and 8, but their thematic definitely revolves around family relations, with 7 putting greater focus on the broader family, while 8 focuses on the parent-child relationship. And now that begs the question, what is Resident Evil Requiem possibly going to be about? Well, we simply cannot know for sure until the game comes out. But judging from the trailer and all the information we have, we can still speculate. I noticed that the trailer showcased different men who were wearing suits being killed. I don't know if it's just me, but those men kind of look like politicians, which makes me wonder if Requiem will touch on the topic of politics and corruption. And even if those men in suits are not politicians, but FBI agents instead, the game could still talk broadly about corruption. This is only fan speculation, but just judging from the way that Grace's boss convinced her to go to the Redwood Hotel, where she probably got captured, I think the guy is sus. And if that's the case, then the plot of the game will show that not even institutions like the FBI can escape corruption. Of course, in the same manner that there were still remnants of the previous themes in RE7 and 8, the same is going to be true for Requiem. The fact that the protagonist still struggles with grief and trauma due to the loss of her mother shows that there will be an aspect of the personal type of horror seen in RE7 and 8, and the fact that the game will bring us back to Raccoon City also shows that the themes of the earlier games will be thrown in the mix. And that's all that I have to say. Wow, this was a long series of videos. But what do you think? Do you agree with some of my theories? Or perhaps there is something you think that I got completely wrong? In any of those cases, please let me know in the comments below. And while you're at it, also let me know if you enjoy this type of content and would like to see more, or if you would like to see a deep analysis like the ones that I usually do on the channel covering a Resident Evil game. I hope you have enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.